A small scratch. Almost like a graze. That's how it all started. So small and innocuous that I almost missed it as I went about my morning routine. It wasn't until I caught sight of my arm in the mirror that I noticed the red strip of aggravated flesh, about the size of a bottle cap, glaring angrily from the underside of my forearm. I looked at it through the reflective surface of the mirror as I brushed my teeth, perplexed. I was prone to injuries like this. Small scrapes and bruises often appeared on my limbs, leaving me wondering exactly how I'd gotten them. Racking my brains, I tried to recall anything that might shed some light on how I'd managed to get this particular one. But try as I might, I came up blank. I always put it down to being clumsy. I'd probably just walked into something a little too hard, not paying attention to where I was walking, and not noticing the scrape until I caught sight of its aftermath several hours later. Either way, they never worried me. They were just something I'd come to expect. They would go away in a couple of days, and I'd be back to normal. But something about this one was odd. Normally, whenever I noticed the results of my clumsiness, I'd feel something as soon as I saw it. A throb of pain, or the warmth of inflamed flesh as my mind realized that my body was injured. Some kind of unpleasant sensation, warning me to be more careful next time. It's funny how you don't feel them sometimes until you see them. Like your brain only realizes at that moment that it's supposed to be hurting. But as I stared at this new scrape on my arm, I felt nothing. No pain, no heat, nothing. Leaning in closer to better inspect the wound, I could clearly see that several layers of skin seemed to have been torn away. The red, meaty flesh beneath was almost exposed to the surface. It should have been agonizing, all of the nerves and sinew exposed to the air like that. But still, I felt nothing. Even more confused, I reached my hand to it and gingerly pressed my fingers against the raw surface. It was deep, deeper than anything I'd done by accident before. Expecting my protesting nerves to shoot an agonizing jolt of pain through me as my fingers made contact, I tensed, readying myself for the oncoming wave. But there was nothing. I could feel the wound, and I could feel my fingers pressing against it. But there was no pain, no heat, nothing. Just what the hell was going on with my arm? I must have caused some sort of nerve damage or something. Ripped away the nerves on the surface level and damaged the ones that were exposed so badly that they couldn't even communicate with the pain receptors. I could probably still feel my fingers as I lightly touched the graze due to the skin in the surrounding area reacting to the pressure change. Dumbfounded by what I was seeing, I stood staring at the pill-shaped mark in the mirror. A thought snapped me out of my stupor as I watched the pinkish flesh glistening. It was exposed. Even though it didn't hurt, I needed to cover it up. The last thing I wanted was for it to get infected, especially if I couldn't feel it. Reaching down, I opened the drawers of the cabinet below my sink and fished around. I kept all of my medical supplies there. Plasters, pills, thermometers, and most importantly, bandages. Grabbing a roll and dragging them out, I set the tap running and allowed a small amount of water to pool in the basin. Adding a few drops of antibacterial soap into the small pool, I carefully scooped the water into my hand and washed the open wound. Once satisfied that it was thoroughly clean, I wrapped the bandage around it tightly, cutting it to size with a pair of scissors that I awkwardly fished out of the cabinet. I still couldn't feel it, even with the fabric of the bandage pressing against it, even when my shirt rubbed it as I got ready to leave for work. After a few hours, I'd almost completely forgotten it was there at all. It just felt like a normal day. I went about my work as usual, enjoying the hustle and bustle of my office, chatting with my co-workers and trying to clear the backlog of tasks that had slowly been snowing me under these past few days. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. After changing from my work clothes into something more comfortable, I had made myself a quick ready meal, sweet and sour chicken, and sat in front of the TV to relax. After binge-watching 6 episodes of a show that my colleague had recommended, I could barely keep my eyes open anymore. Placing my plate back in the kitchen, I made my way to the bedroom to clean my teeth and get ready for bed. As I entered the room, I caught sight of myself in the mirror again. The bandage around my forearm was still exactly where I left it, clinging tightly to me. The sight of it brought the memories of this morning flooding back. Carefully, I peeled it away, revealing that nasty pill-sized gouge. It looked the same as it had this morning, red, aggravated and raw. But to my relief, there were no signs of yellowing or pus developing. There was a small patch of blood on the bandage where it looked like it might have wept slightly, but that was it. I washed it again, making sure that it was thoroughly clean before making my way to my bedroom. I thought it was probably best to leave it open to the air as I slept. After all, that's what the doctors say helps most cuts heal faster. Getting changed into my pajamas, I clambered into bed, getting myself comfortable before exhaustion overwhelmed me and I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The sound of my alarm blaring startled me awake. The morning sunlight was seeping in below the curtains as I clumsily swung at the alarm clock in an attempt to stop its incessant sound. After a couple of attempts, my hand fell on the stop button and the ringing ceased. Groggily getting to my feet, I stumbled into the bathroom to get myself ready for another day at the office. The light stung my eyes as I flicked the switch and made my way over to the sink. Putting some toothpaste on my brush and bringing it up to my teeth, a cold sweat broke out and I dropped it as my strength left me. There was another one, another graze, right there on my forearm, right next to the first one. They were identical, the same shape, the same size, the same red flesh glaring out from beneath. How had I managed to do it again? I stared at it, wide-eyed, not sure of what to think, not sure of how I could have managed to get another identical wound on my arm without noticing it for a second time. Just like the first one, there was no pain, no feeling as I scrutinized it in the mirror. I reached my fingers into it again, gingerly feeling around to make sure it was really there, that I wasn't going insane. When my fingers caressed it, they felt the skin drop into a small chasm of flesh. But there was only the same light pressure as yesterday. I tried to replay everything I'd done that previous day in my mind, my eyes darting back and forth between the two wounds. I forced myself to remember every little action, no matter how small. Nothing jumped out. I couldn't remember having any clumsy incidents yesterday. There had been a few close calls, sure, but nothing that would have resulted in a scratch, let alone an identical graze. How the hell had I managed to do it again? It didn't make any sense. Filling the sink, I washed both of my wounds carefully, bandaging them up again tightly before putting on my shirt. Just like yesterday, I couldn't feel the wounds through the bandages. Couldn't feel them when my shirt rubbed against them. Couldn't feel them when I rested my arms on the desk at work. With them being out of sight, it was like they weren't even there. But I knew they were there. The thought of them kept on invading my mind as I sat there, staring at the screen of my computer. I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about how those ugly wounds had appeared from seemingly out of nowhere. Why couldn't I feel them? Surely with how deep they were, I'd have felt something when I caused them. Maybe it had happened in my sleep? Maybe I'd been in that deep of a sleep that I'd not woken up. That still didn't explain why they were identical, though. The hours seemed to crawl by as I tried my best to focus on my work, my thoughts always returning to the gouges on my arm. Regardless of how hard I tried, I could barely focus on what my co-workers were saying as they engaged in their usual office chats with me. A few of them could tell that I was distracted. Each asked me if I was okay, if there was something wrong, but what could I tell them? They'd think that I was just fixating on a random coincidence, making a mountain out of a molehill. After what felt like an eternity, it was finally time to go home. Walking through my front door, I didn't feel any better. I went about my evening almost robotically, unable to fully relax and unwind. Cooking myself a quick meal without really paying too much attention to what I was doing, I sat in front of the TV again, ready to continue with the binge watching. After a few episodes, the flashing images on the screen weren't enough to hold my attention as I kept glancing down at the bandage on my arm. Eventually, the light from outside faded, and with it, tiredness followed. Making my way to the bathroom again, I brushed my teeth before gently removing the bandage from my arm. There were 2 red patches on it this time, from where I'd undoubtedly caused myself to bleed when I rested my arm on the desk. The 2 grazes were both the same size as before, still red and raw, but clear of any signs of infection. I stared at them again, leaning in to scrutinize them for any clues as to how I could have caused them. The skin around their edges looked rough and torn. Whatever it was that I'd done had obviously ripped the skin away rather than cut into it. Surely I would have felt that. Still, frustratingly, nothing came to mind. Drying them off, I took one last perplexed look at them before heading to bed. Another dreamless sleep took me quickly, and before I knew it, the blaring of the alarm clock roused me from slumber. Just like the day before, I staggered from my bed to the bathroom. Standing in front of the mirror yet again, I glanced down at the wounds on my arm, and ice filled my veins. There were 2 more. 2 more deep gouges in my skin, perfectly in line with the other 2. Just like the others, there was no pain in my arm, no sign that I'd torn away layer upon layer of skin to reveal the tender meat beneath. They just sat there, glaring at me, surrounded by the inflamed red flesh on either side. This couldn't be happening. There had only been 2 when I went to sleep. How had I managed to injure myself not once, but twice more in exactly the same way, all while I slept? It was impossible. There was no way that this was just a coincidence. Rushing back to my bedroom, I frantically threw the covers off my bed. I was looking for something, anything that would explain how this kept happening. Maybe a shard of something sharp or the pointed edge of a spring in the mattress sticking out, just something. As the covers dropped to the floor, They revealed the clear bedding beneath, just as it had always been, other than for a few small patches. I'd not noticed them before, paying minimal attention to my bed as I came and went, but right where my right arm would have rested were a few small, slowly browning patches, intermingled with fresher red colours. Leaning closer, the unmistakable metallic stench of iron filled my nostrils. Blood. Dried blood. It had to be from my arm. Frantically feeling around the area, I half expected to feel a shooting pain in my finger as I stumbled upon whatever hidden hazard was responsible. But there was nothing, just the soft cotton of the sheets. I didn't understand. There had to be something. There had to be. These things seemed to happen when I was asleep. I was convinced of it. There had to be something in my bed. How else would I have managed to injure myself like that? I searched for another few minutes, feeling around the entirety of my bed and the floor surrounding it. But it was ultimately fruitless. The room was clean and clear as it had ever been. There was nothing to explain what was happening. Defeated, I trudged back to the bathroom, unable to shake the growing worry that had rooted itself in my mind. What was happening to me? Would I wake up tomorrow with more of these things? Why didn't they hurt? Washing all of them as best I could, I bandaged them up and got dressed. Regardless of how I was feeling, I still needed to get to work. Making a mental note to buy more bandages on the way home, I set out, trying and failing to ignore the steadily panicked thoughts swirling around in my head. There were more the next day. I awoke to the light seeping in through the curtains, my scalp tightening and my heart beating out of my chest as I saw the patches of blood on my bed again. 3 more. Inspecting my arm, sure enough, 3 new gashes were there, surrounded by inflamed red skin. Each of the new abrasions was uniformly sitting next to the others as they glared back at me. Each of the gashes was as deep and aggressive looking as the last, revealing my crimson, exposed flesh beneath. I could see the muscles below squirm and tense as I moved my fingers, bile rising in my throat as the tendons slid back and forth beneath the tissue. My right arm now looked as though a part of it had been thrust into a knife fight, the deep tears covering the majority of one side of it as they snaked their way around my pale flesh, looking like crimson mountains. I still couldn't feel them. No matter how hard I pressed my fingers into the warm, wet tissue, all I could feel was the pressure. Why didn't they hurt? My mind began to spiral. I didn't know what to do, or how to stop these cuts from happening. Yes, they'd all been on my arm for the moment. But what would happen if they ended up somewhere else? Like my face? My eyes? If I'd been able to tear away several layers of skin, then my eyes would stand no chance. And come to think of it, where was my skin? The chunks in my arm were pretty sizable, large enough that there should have been some remnant of the flesh that used to be there, a piece of it resting on my bed next to where it had been torn away. But there had been nothing when I checked yesterday, and there was nothing now. Just the fresh bloodstains on my sheets. I needed help. I didn't know what was happening. A part of me wanted to go to the doctors or the hospital, to show them my arm and tell them how it was happening each night as I slept. But a bigger part of me knew how I would sound to them. I'd be lucky not to get sectioned. No, I needed to talk to someone, to try and get my head straight. I couldn't face the thought of going into work. I couldn't think straight as it was, and I couldn't face the questions from my co-workers. Sure, I could bandage my arm again, but it was going to get to the point where the bandages would be clearly visible through my shirt, and that would come with the inevitable, albeit well-meaning, interrogations. As soon as I finished on the phone with my boss, I called my best friend James. I needed to talk to someone, and James was the only person I could think of who wouldn't look at me like I was going insane. Dialing his number, I held the phone to my ear, hoping against hope that he would answer. I needed to speak to someone. I felt so vulnerable in my home, so unsafe. After a few agonizing rings, he picked up, greeting me in his usual loud, jovial fashion. His demeanor soon dropped to one of concern as he picked up on my desperate, terrified tones. After frantically trying to explain what was happening, I could tell from the way he responded that James didn't understand what I was talking about. He could tell that I was panicked though, and said that he would come over after he finished work later on that day. It couldn't come fast enough for me. Sure enough, gone 5 p.m. the doorbell rang, and James stood on the other side. I invited him in, trying not to look too panicked. I didn't want to worry him any more than I already had. Once he was sitting comfortably on my 2-seater sofa, I began to slowly explain what had happened. The marks on my arm, the fact that each morning there seemed to be more and more, and I couldn't figure out why. He looked at me skeptically at first, assuming that this was some kind of prank, that I was trying to set him up. I could tell from the look on his face, though, that he was concerned, as his eyes quickly darted towards my bandaged arm before flicking back to mine. I could tell he needed more proof, so, very carefully, I peeled back the bandages. They had stuck in places where the gashes had leaked, the dried blood adhering the bandages to my skin. Peeling them away, James's face dropped as I presented my arm to him. He winced as he leaned in closer, the colour draining from his face as he watched my muscles slowly moving in the open air, exposed to the elements. They look kinda like scratches. That's all James could say as he forced his gaze away from my torn flesh. Confused, I asked him what he meant. He proceeded to reach out, spreading his fingers and hovering them over each of the gashes. I'd never noticed it before, but with his fingers hovering just inches above my arm, it was clear that the uniform pattern of the wounds followed the pattern of splayed fingers. James made a clawing motion to further iterate his point, making me feel sick to my stomach. A chilling thought crossed my mind. What if someone was doing this to me? Waiting for me to sleep, and then cutting my arm or something? Some kind of psycho with blades on their fingers. I know it sounds crazy, straight out of some cheesy 80s horror movie. But then so does the idea of several identical wounds appearing overnight. No, I was going crazy. There was no way things like that existed. My panicked mind was just jumping to conclusions based on random coincidences. There had to be a rational explanation for all of this. There was no way these were actually scratches. They just happened to fit the pattern. James laughed to himself about how absurd his suggestion was. I laughed too, although I couldn't quite suppress the nervous quaver in my voice as the thought of someone doing this to me lurked in the back of my mind. James stayed with me for another few hours after that, trying his best to figure out what was happening to me. He suggested perhaps speaking to the doctors, or at the very least getting them to check out the wounds, to make sure they weren't going to become septic. I shot that idea down with the well-rehearsed argument I'd had in my own head earlier that morning. What we needed to figure out, what I really needed to know, was how this kept on happening. After throwing suggestions back and forth, it felt like we were both no closer to having any answers. Both coming up blank before he ultimately had to go home. He needed to get himself ready for work tomorrow and see his kids before they went to bed. As much as I didn't want him to leave, I didn't want to be on my own. I knew there was nothing I could do to make him stay. I watched helplessly as he waved from the other side of the door, reassuring me that everything would be okay, that we'd figure it out, before closing it behind him and leaving me alone in my house. That thought from earlier wiggled its way to the front of my mind again. What if someone was doing this? After all, now that James had pointed it out, the marks did look deliberate, almost man-made. What if it wasn't a coincidence? My mind worked overtime as I started to pull together an idea. This kept happening while I was asleep, so I had no way of seeing what was actually going on. If I could just see myself while I was sleeping, then maybe I could finally understand what was happening. Going into my room, I glanced around before my gaze settled on my bedside table. If I were to lean my phone against my lamp, it would be angled perfectly to catch my right side as I slept. I'd be able to see my right arm all night. Then I could watch it back in the morning and see exactly what I'd done. For the first time in the last couple of days, excitement welled up in me as I solidified the idea in my head. This was going to work. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it sooner. This whole ordeal was nearly over. I was probably just catching my arm on something, and now I'd finally see what. Although the idea of sleeping still instilled a sense of dread in me, knowing that there would likely be more nauseating gashes on my arm in the morning, it still did nothing to dampen the anticipation of finally finding out what was going on. I went about my evening, almost excited about going to bed, watching TV until I was sufficiently tired that I could fall asleep. Following the same routine as the previous nights, I washed my slashed arm thoroughly before cleaning my teeth and changing into my pajamas, then clambered into bed. Setting my phone in its position, I turned off the lamp, and in the darkness of my room, I sank into a soft slumber. The blaring sound of my alarm clock roused me from sleep again as I forced myself up into a sitting position, slowly remembering the events of last night. I glanced down at my right arm again and shuddered. Sure enough, there were 4 fresh gouges. The sheet where my arm was resting was now stained again with dried blood. I winced as I stared at the raw, exposed sinew. They were further up my arm now, slowly climbing towards my bicep. Although they glared at me, inflamed and aggressive looking, there was still no pain. I felt sick just looking at them. They were a grotesque tapestry of fleshy crevasses with scarlet mountains descending to bare tendons and muscle beneath. Trying my best to ignore the bile slowly rising in my throat, and suppressing the terrified thoughts that threatened to overtake me, I saw my phone sitting there on the bedside table, still recording, just as I'd left it. Snatching it from the nightstand, I stopped the recording, eager to watch through the playback to finally put an end to all of this. As I sat there, skimming through the video, My heartbeat fluttered in anticipation. I was about to finally find out just what the hell was happening. Scouring the first few hours of the footage, there was nothing. Just me lying there asleep, hardly moving. It was strange seeing myself like that, so still and peaceful. Still, it didn't dampen my excitement. It just meant that whatever was happening had happened later into the night. However, as the hours of footage trickled by at quadruple speed, and the screen remained almost still, only my occasional stirrings giving any indication that the video was still running, I couldn't help the feeling of hopelessness that slowly started seeping its way back in. Sudden movement from the screen caught me off guard, and, much to my dismay, I saw myself slowly propping myself up in bed as the distorted sound of the alarm clock rang out through the speakers. The footage continued as I reached out for the screen before it came to an abrupt end. The soft sting of tears burned in my eyes as I sat there on my bed, defeated. I tried to make sense of what I'd seen on the camera. There was nothing at all. I'd woken up with 4 of these god-awful wounds, but there was still no explanation. As far as I could tell from the video, I'd hardly even moved in my sleep. Maybe shifted positions once or twice, but nothing that would have resulted in this. There was nothing else. No crazy person cutting at my arm. So how the hell had I ended up with even more wounds? Another panicked thought flashed through my mind. Was I seeing things? Were the wounds even there? Mindlessly, my hand slid across my raw arm, my fingers skimming along the smooth, soft skin before it gave way to the spongy tissue below. Again, the pressure was the only indication that they were there at all. Were the sensations just in my head, maybe? My mind somehow tricking me into seeing and feeling these things, even tricking me into seeing the blood on the bed. That would explain why there was no pain. No, it couldn't all be in my head. James had seen them when he'd come over yesterday. He'd commented on them, held his hand over them. He knew they were there, so they had to be real. But then if that was the case, if they were real, they were somehow appearing on my arm with no explanation. I'd have almost preferred it if they had been a figment of my imagination. At least I could explain that. The flood of panicked thoughts overtook me again, almost suffocating me with their intensity. I felt trapped, lost, alone. I called in sick to work again, hardly registering the notes of sympathy in my boss's voice as he expressed his concern. I couldn't think straight. I needed to get out of there. It felt like the walls were slowly closing in on me, like they were waiting for me to turn my back on them so they could take another chunk out of me. After quickly washing and bandaging my arm, and then getting dressed, I decided to go for a walk to try and clear my mind. That walk ended up turning into several trips around the town. I found myself coming up with any excuse not to go back to my house. Although I had no idea what was happening to me, every time I discovered a new gash, it had been just after I'd slept in the house, and the thought of going back made me feel so completely vulnerable that I couldn't bear it. I went to the park and sat on the benches, watching the branches of the trees listing in the wind, and listening to the trickle of the small stream that snaked its way through it. The beautiful surroundings, normally soothing and tranquil, were all suppressed by the cloud of worry that was eclipsing my senses. What the hell was happening, and how could I stop it? I couldn't help the terrifying new thought that kept worming its way into my brain. As stupid as it sounded, if there was nothing physical responsible for this, as the video from this morning had proven, then what if there was something incorporeal? The idea of blaming the supernatural felt silly to me. I never much cared for ghost stories or the like, always seeing them as a fun way to scare people and nothing more. But with everything that was happening, I was willing to try just about anything to make sense of it. After a long day of conflicting thoughts and aimless wandering, the sun began to sink in the sky, casting slowly dimming golden rays across the tarmac of the streets. It was going to be getting dark soon, and as much as the idea of going back to my house filled me with dread, I knew I couldn't stay out there on the streets. Reluctantly returning home, I gingerly opened the door, half expecting someone to jump out at me as I entered. The door opened to reveal the darkness of my home. As quiet as ever, no sign of anything moving or having been moved since I left that morning. Still, I couldn't relax knowing that something here was the cause of these mysterious wounds on my arm, just waiting for me to sleep again. Glancing down at the bandage, the idea of a supernatural cause floated to the forefront of my mind. I knew it was silly, but I indulged the thought, actively considering that it might be a possibility. Grabbing my laptop and booting it up, I sat there on my sofa for the next few hours, searching online for anything that might explain, well, anything. I scoured page after page of numerous different sites. Some just relayed ghost stories or creepypastas, while others held forums discussing other unexplained phenomena. There was nothing that could help me though. I almost laughed as I imagined what I would say to myself if I'd seen myself reduced to this a week ago. I'd have probably laughed in my face at how absurd I was being. Still, I needed to be sure. With each link I clicked, I could feel the hopelessness of my situation bearing down on me. This was futile. I didn't know what to do. There had to be something, some kind of explanation. Someone had to know what was going on. They just had to. After hours of fruitless searching, exhaustion tugged at my eyelids, the hours of staring at a bright screen in a slowly darkening room finally taking their toll. I found myself having to reread line after line of some of the articles, their meaning not seeping in at all through the haze of fatigue. I lasted about another half an hour before my eyelids dropped one final time, staying firmly shut as I succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep right there on the sofa. I slept terribly that night, being more accustomed to the soft mattress of my bed rather than the firm cushions of the sofa. When I finally opened my eyes, it was still dark. The moonlight seeped in from the cracks in the curtains, and the screen of my laptop had long since darkened. I had no idea how long I'd been laying there for. I tried to stand, to stumble to my bedroom and collapse onto my bed, but my legs remained still and unmoving. Struggling through the fog of sleep, I tried to raise my leg again, but it ignored my commands. Panic set in slightly as I tried to at least sit up, but again my body ignored me. Frantically trying with all my might, nothing happened. My body lay as still as the dead. My eyes grew wide as I realized what was happening. I was paralyzed on the sofa. I couldn't tell if this was a dream or if I was awake. All I knew was that I wanted this to stop. Why was my body not listening to me? Was this sleep paralysis? I'd never experienced it before, but I'd heard the stories people told and they always sounded awful. The thoughts whirled around in my head as I stared at the ceiling. A subtle movement from the corner of my eye caught my attention, and my blood ran cold. I flicked my eyes up towards its source, terrified that there could be something in the room with me while I was trapped here like this. But it was hiding in the darkness just beyond my eye line. Then there it was again, that same frantic, almost scuttling movement. I swear it got closer this time, like whatever was responsible was crouched just behind my head, right next to the arm of the sofa. My scalp tightened as I imagined someone squatting down next to me, ready to do God knows what while all I could do was lie here, trapped. I scrunched my eyes shut, willing this to stop, for my body to just respond to me. Another scraping sound crept through the darkness. It was closer this time, my eyes snapping open again instantly. A broken moan was all that seemed to escape my lips as I tried my hardest to scream. Hands! A pair of greying, skeletal hands were floating above my eyes. Their emaciated, knotted fingers seemed to stretch over me as I lay there, unable to move. All I could do was watch in horror as they slithered their way over my torso, coming from somewhere just behind me. This couldn't be happening. There was no way this was real. This had to be that sleep paralysis demon that everyone talked about. This all had to be in my head. Try as I might to cling to that thought, it did nothing to make me feel any better as I watched those frail hands slowly working their way towards the bandages covering my arm. With a gentle, graceful motion, they slowly undid the knot tying the bandage, and I felt it slipping away. It took me a second to register it, but as soon as I did, I let out another stifled scream. I felt it. If this was all in my head, then how had the bandages fallen away? This was real. It had to be. The same wheezing exhales escaped my lips as I strained to try and turn around. I needed to get away. As far away as I could from whatever was behind me. A soft, shushing sound filled my ear, so close that I could feel the breath of whatever spoke it. I froze, a fresh wave of terror washing over me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to look up, terrified as to what I would see, but my head still refused to move. All I could do was watch, petrified, as one of the long, broken fingernails of those spindly fingers reached out. It hovered above my arm, as though waiting for something, completely still for several seconds, before the jagged edge plunged deep into my skin. I winced as it sawed its way through layer after layer of skin, embedding itself further into my flesh. I gritted my teeth in preparation for the jolt of searing pain I knew was sure to come, but it didn't. Slowly, it pulled back and lifted, ripping up a tattered strip of my bloodied skin. I watched in disgust as it flapped there, dangling from the jagged fingernail like a fleshy plaster, still attached to the rest of my arm. With the same graceful precision as it had used to undo the bandage, the other hand slowly moved in, slicing away at the skin with a sawing motion of its cracked thumbnail until the ribbon of flesh was freed. Lifting their gruesome prize free, the hands began to retract. As they slowly retreated above my face, the dangling flesh clinging to the cracked nails, I stared in horror, unable to take my eyes off the piece of me that had just been carved away. I could make out my hair clearly, each individual strand reflecting the moonlight. The fat and remnants of connective tissue that sat beneath it made me feel nauseous as it dangled inches above my face. I tried to scream again, hot tears beginning to work their way down my cheeks as the hand steadily dragged the strip of flesh out of my eyeline and back towards whatever it was that was sitting behind me, all the while softly shushing me with its unnatural voice. I just wanted this to stop. I couldn't understand what was happening. I kept telling myself that this wasn't real. Although I knew better, I could see it happening right in front of me. All I could think was that this had to be a figment of my imagination. It had to be. I was going mad. Because if all this was real, then it meant that there was some ungodly creature sitting inches away from me, stealing pieces of my skin as I watched on, helpless. What did it want? Why was it doing this to me? No, this had to be in my head, a result of the sleep paralysis. Movement caught my eye again as the hands reappeared, slowly snaking their way back across my torso towards my arm again. The strip of bloodied skin was no longer dangling from the wretched nails, but the index finger of one of the hands was dyed a deep crimson. I watched in horror, unable to move, unable to scream as this scene played out again and again, the fingers peeling away strip after strip of my flesh. Each time I could clearly see the nail plunging into my arm, slowly tearing away a ribbon of skin, before the other moved in, ripping it from me and snatching it away, still glistening with blood as it was lifted above my head. A small trail had formed along the path the hands took, some of the still warm droplets falling onto my face. I could feel the heat of the blood, smell the metallic iron that made my stomach churn, but all I could do was stare up, terrified as it ran down my face and pulled with my steadily flowing tears. After the 5th time that this happened, the hands retreated beyond my eyeline. I waited, unmoving as my heartbeat pounded in my ears, expecting the hands to reappear at any second and steal another chunk of my flesh. I could hear sounds from behind me, shuffling and scraping combined with a strange, wet squelching, getting further away as whatever that thing was must have retreated back into the darkness, leaving me alone, motionless on the sofa. I lay there for I don't know how long. A few minutes, a few hours, I wasn't sure. I couldn't shake the image of those grotesque hands. Flashes of them digging and tearing at my flesh were playing over and over in my head. The room was deathly silent now. Any sound, no matter how small or inconspicuous, set me on edge as I lay staring at the ceiling. I expected that thing to return at any moment, not satisfied with what it had already taken, ready to reach out those decrepit fingers and steal yet more of my skin. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my limbs started responding to me again. Shakily forcing myself up, I pulled my right arm towards me and inspected the 5 new gouges. Nausea washed over me as I stared in horror. They were there, plain as day, glaring at me next to the others. My arm now resembled something you might find in a butcher's shop, with several spots of raw meat clearly visible from the deep pits of missing skin. It was real. That thing. It was real and it was taking my skin. I didn't know what it was or why it was doing this to me, but it must have been taking slivers of my skin for the past several nights while I slept. I frantically scanned the room, expecting to find whatever that thing was lurking in the shadows, ready to leap out and finish the job now that I was aware of it. I needed to get out of there. I didn't know where that thing had gone, or if it was just biding its time, waiting for me to fall asleep again for another opportunity to steal more of my flesh. Without a second thought, I snatched up my keys and ran for the front door. Charging across the drive to my car, I flung the door open and fumbled the keys in the ignition, not even bothering to reach for my seatbelt. The car roared into life and I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, racing out of my driveway and onto the main road. I needed to go somewhere, anywhere but here. I had no idea what time it was. It was still dark, so I assumed it must have been late, but I didn't care. I found James's number in my phone and rang it. After several seconds he answered, his voice groggy from being dragged out of what I can only assume was a pleasant slumber. I don't think he quite understood what I was saying as he fought off the clutches of sleep, but he could tell from my distraught mumblings between the sobs racking my chest that I was clearly distressed. When I arrived at his house a few minutes later, I was a wreck. The adrenaline that had obviously been coursing through my system, triggering my sudden flight, had begun to dissipate, leaving me shaking and exhausted. James opened the door in his dressing gown, a perplexed look across his slack face. I felt a slight pang of guilt as I saw the bags under his eyes, but I needed to talk to someone. I explained everything, showing him the fresh gashes on my arms where those godforsaken fingers had ripped away the skin. He looked at me horrified as I relayed the story of how I'd been trapped there, forced to watch as they tore away strip after strip. I could tell he was worried about me, thinking that perhaps I'd mentally cracked. I couldn't blame him. Nothing about this made any semblance of sense. He offered for me to stay with him for a while, and I couldn't thank him enough. My relief was short-lived though, as the following day, more gashes appeared along my arm. Although I was staying at James's house, that thing must have followed me somehow. Somehow it knew where to find me. That was 3 weeks ago, and it's only getting worse. It's already taken all of the skin from my right arm now, and it's moving on to my left. I don't know what to do. It keeps working its way along, taking small patches at a time. Every day it takes more than the last. No one knows what it is, or what it wants. I can't find anything online that helps. The cuts still don't hurt, but I'm terrified. It's only a matter of time before I get an infection, or something worse. But there's something else too. Another thought that keeps me up at night. All I can think about is, what happens when there's no more skin left? Hey guys, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I really appreciate each and every one of you watching. If you enjoyed this story, please feel free to check out my other videos for more original horror content. I've also released a full-length novel based on my "That Church is Abandoned for a Reason" story. It's available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon. I've popped a link in the description. Check it out if you enjoyed my work. Thanks again for listening. Until our next descent into the darkness, remember, it's never just a story.